Welcome to the Hiki-Goma podcast. I'm Elliot. I don't have an intro for this yet because it's only the second episode, but I'm going to be talking about my ongoing experiences writing, producing, directing, and eventually marketing manga in the hopes that my experiences, predominantly my failures, are useful to you. You don't have to write manga. I have a film background and I work in film. So any sort of creative writing I think will be applicable here. Anyway, let's get into it. I'm still working with the structure of this show, but in general, I think I'm going to continue talking through my experiences with the research phase. I'm going to go basically through early pre-production all the way through production, then into, yada yada, post and so on. In the meanwhile, I'm also going to intersperse this with what I'm currently dealing with, since that's a lot more fresh. Right now, I'm in the process of the early kind of rough page production stage of one manga series I have called Aegis. So I think I'm going to continue talking about this previous experience with research first. I'm continuing on from the first episode, the previous episode. If you haven't seen that, then there's a link in the description. Anyway, so continuing with a discussion of research, and I think also some clarifications. I think a lot of this is going to be refining what I talked about last time. So just to recap, I think one of the key things I ended up addressing, and something I didn't really necessarily think of consciously, is this concept of needing to validate what you're doing with real experience. By that I mean people, including myself. I feel like I'm one of the worst examples of this, of falling into this trap of feeling as if you can control everything. You can control your entire story just by planning it meticulously, but not writing a single line of dialogue. And I had people tell me, and I saw advice urging against this, and I didn't follow it because I thought, no, I mean, those people, they don't know what they're doing, or, they're not planning something as complicated as I'm planning, and I should have listened to them, although I felt like maybe their arguments never really struck home with me. It was just you have to write, you have to write, you have to write. And I put that down to those people being, what you'd call pantsers, right? They're just people who, they're just going to free flow the writing. They don't care about planning. I went, okay, we just have a different philosophy. However, I was wrong. I was definitely wrong. I want to kind of expand on that idea a little bit more, though, with some kind of, I guess you'd call them external examples. The first is this idea of interleaving. This is a concept, honestly, I had not heard the technical term for this until maybe like 2 months ago. So I'm not going to pretend like I'm an expert on this or anything, but it's something that I had been unknowingly practicing for some time with a few different skills that I had been learning just in my life. So simply put, interleaving is the retrieval of information in different methods. So let's say that I happen to teach you some Japanese words, and then you happened to then have to take a test on those Japanese words. Well, now that's one method of having to recall. Then someone asks you questions in person about them, and they said, hey, can you explain to me, how this grammar concept works? That's another form of interleaving. If you then had to watch a show that was in Japanese, then you picked up, oh, they're using that word. That's another form of interleaving. If you then had to speak, oh, now I'm having to produce this from memory and use it in context in a conversation. That's another form of interleaving. And I'm not, again, an expert on this. I've only recently heard this term coined, but basically it's kind of the buzz, I guess, in what you'd call like meta educational research, research on how we learn. And basically a bunch of studies show that it's really, really pretty much like the most powerful thing for cementing high levels of knowledge in a thing, because it's forcing you to engage with it in all of these different manners, in all of these different contexts. Okay, so obviously the question is, how does that relate to writing? The simplest way I can think of to apply this to writing, and this is what I eventually ended up doing, and this kind of broke me out of this basically year-long rut of pure research where I did not write a single line of script. I did not write a single line of dialogue. It was just outlining. It was writing my themes down, I guess, in almost mini essays. It was writing out character descriptions, character backstories, it was writing out lore. It was creating elaborate flowcharts of the metaphysics. It's a real shame because I've shown this particular mind map to some of my friends and they're like, you're insane. Like, this is an insane, like, what is this? This has 500 branches to it. And unfortunately, I can't show it because it is just like major spoilers for series I have. So maybe, like, you know, in a few years' time, I'll be able to demonstrate what this actually looks like. But just basically, long story short, as I iterated very clearly last time, huge fucking waste of time. And the thing that broke me out was interleaving, was starting to write. But it wasn't just writing, it was doing both. It was having both an input and an output. But it was also about having multiple kinds of input. Let's just make it really simple. Input is the research, broadly speaking, let's say non-fiction research you're taking in, as well as whatever stories you're reading, or even just people you're meeting, right? You know, if you just meet a fascinating person and you're like, oh, you just have to be a character in my story, like this, you're just gonna kind of writing yourself here. That's all input. You're just filling up the well of your inspiration, I guess, knowledge, whatever. And the outputting is basically just writing. But I think it could also be, broadly speaking, I guess outlining is a kind of outputting. But I guess, as I'll talk about later, the best methods are those that most closely replicate the real situation. So, for instance, to go back to language learning, as I've said before, I'm studying Japanese. It's how I communicate with all of the artists I hire for manga. Every artist I've hired is Japanese. We speak exclusively in Japanese. And something, for instance, that I've come across that, you know, lots of people do, but if you think about it, it kind of obviously is not really effective, is what people will do is they'll listen to these, you know, language CDs, for instance, that are made for beginners. And it's someone, let's say if it was for English speakers, it would be like, I am going to the restaurant tomorrow. And then people people listen to that and they might get a bit of learning out of that. And then they go into the real world. Very classic example, if you really ask most language learners who are doing more traditional study methods, they're just going to tell you that they, you know, let's say in America, a typical story is that, you know, they would study Spanish for a bunch of years and then they try to talk to, you know, someone from South America and they say, yeah, they were speaking way too quickly, couldn't understand them. Or real life Spanish or real life, you know, insert language here is totally different to what I learned in the books. And so that's an example of this bubble reality, just studying something that isn't reality. And it goes to outputting as well. I think outputting is like the technical term for speaking a foreign language that you're studying. Outputting is like the linguistic term, I mean. And so the same goes there. People who do these rote, like practice, you know, things with other non-native students, other people who suck at the language going, you know, watashi wa ringo da, or, you know, whatever crap. That's not the real language. That's this laboratory, completely fake setting. And the problem is that, you know, it's just this bubble and it doesn't set them up for the real world. And really what they should have been doing the entire time is trying to get as close to real world conditions as possible. Now, so I'm just going to apologize in advance. I know I'm talking a lot about language learning. It's just, I find it very easy to make, you know, analogies to that. You know, these learners, right, what really they should have been doing the entire time is watching native content, watching the things that natives would be watching, or they should be speaking to natives, things that they're going to do in reality. Now, those are going to be difficult. And there are ways to take, you know, baby steps into the deep end, if that makes sense. Yeah, the same applies to writing, basically. If you're just writing an outline, in my mind at the time, I was like, well, no, I'm writing a ton. I wrote about, and I used to take this as a point of pride, and now I've had a complete reversal on this. I used to kind of brag to people because I wouldn't say, well, maybe not brag, but I had to have, something. I didn't have a story. I'd done a year of research. Oh, how's Aegis going? Well, I've got 3,000 pages of notes. That is true. I have about 3,000 pages of notes. If you collectively count all of my outlining material, if you count all of the book research I've done as well. Now, to be fair, that includes, extensive quoting of sections of books. So a lot of that isn't like literally all of my written material, but overall, if I had to review all of the content that I've, got for Aegis, yeah, it's about 3,000 pages. And I used to be like, hell yeah, that means I've done so much work. I'm so good. Of course, the problem is that there are people who could write stories as good as the one I'm writing who have done 3 pages of outlining, or have done 30, or even 300. And so when you look at it that way, it's like, well, okay, there are people who, have all this, skill in this thing, and they don't require this much crap, basically. I must be doing something wrong. And I can appreciate that in retrospect. It was very hard to understand at the time because I was writing a ton. Every day I would write, I wrote 3,000 pages in a year. It really does not have a lot of utility. Like, do you know how many of those 3,000 pages I am regularly consulting when I'm now fucking starting to produce this series? It's basically zero. It's effectively zero. I still need to kind of do a review of how much of this stuff I actually need to consult. Yeah, it's effectively like I had hyperinflation on my notes, and they suddenly, it's like as soon as I went into writing, all of those 3,000 pages of notes, they're all now worth like 1 cent each, and they used to be worth $1. And now it's like, this is worthless. It's like in the Weimar Republic, they got wheelbarrows of cash. They're burning cash for heat, that kind of thing. I'm going to burn my notes to, stay warm. 3,000 of them. Maybe I'll burn 2,999 and I'll, have 1 page left that's actually of use. I'm being hyperbolic. They're not all useless. There's a lot of stuff in there legitimately that is good. I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I do want to emphasize in this, just to apologize again, very muddled analogy. One of the conditions I kind of had with making this podcast is I wanted to do it on a reasonably exact schedule, even if I felt like shit. Right now, I'm not feeling too hot. I'm actually quite tired. To be honest, I'll talk about this later in the kind of what I've been doing currently section, but I always want this to be a real reflection of what the actual experience is like working on this huge thing. Because I don't need to go on a whole fucking Black Mirror, we live in a society, heckin' social media is bad or whatever. I don't even really use it. Obviously a lot of the time people only see an end product, and especially when I was writing this, I'm still writing, obviously. I'm you write as you produce or whatever. When I was doing this long research and scripting stage that lasted about 2 years. But yeah, I was seeing all these people who had these really polished, finished products, and then you're not seeing any of what's happening in the background, or you're only seeing like, their best moments and their, hey, I'm doing well, I'm successful. And you're not seeing them just being like, I did like 1 page today and I'm just feeling really down about the whole project or whatever, that kind of thing. So yeah, you're going to see, hopefully as this continues, some of just the ups and downs in terms of mood, where it's less stressful, it's more stressful. There's, complete unending despair about everything, the complete doubt, whatever, the whole fucking dark night of the soul, Christ-like figure, sort of messianic, complex kind of things that will probably emerge. Anyway, to get back to whatever fucking analogy I was making there, God knows what it was. Yeah, I got basically trapped in this idea that, oh, I'm outlining. I'm writing all the time. That's good. That's like writing a script. No, it's completely different because outlining is completely safe. What I mean by that is that there's no real threat to the ego if you fail, right? If you write some stupid idea, you can just kind of like be like, whatever, I'm going to write some other idea. Who cares? But a script, probably because it directly involves like emotional aspects with characters and with scenes and so on, and with dialogue, it's a lot more, there's a lot more cognition involved. It's a lot heavier on the brain. I'm not saying that outlining isn't hard. I put extraordinary effort into outlining, of course. And again, some of it's necessary. Yeah, the difference with outlining is that you can just write thousands of notes and then just not read them. But it's kind of hard to write a script that's so long that you can't reread it, because it's like, pulling water out of stone is kind of what writing is like. It's so hard to pump it out. So you're kind of forced with a script to confront a number of things that are going to be emotionally difficult, basically, especially if you're avoidant, especially if you have, I guess a lot of this is touching on what I guess would be typically called like a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset. I'm just assuming that a lot of people who are watching this, that's a pretty commonly known thing at this point, but just very, very briefly, fixed mindset is kind of like fear of failure, almost like shying away from potentially ego damaging experiences, like, oh, I might fail at this, so I shouldn't attempt to do it. I shouldn't really try new things, versus growth mindset, which just kind of accepts failure as like almost the thing that you're looking for. I guess what you'd call safe failure, the equivalent of, if you're rock climbing, you want to be able to fail and have a safety harness so you don't, fall to your death. But you need to be able to fail multiple times with that safety harness in order to be able to actually become a good rock climber, right? You're not going to, scale a mountain once and instantly be an expert. Obviously, the people who are, amazing at it have, as a common quote goes, they failed more times than beginners have even tried to do it. And so, yeah, it really just comes down to, again, sort of a growth mindset thing. It's very easy just to say that, obviously, now in retrospect, just be like, oh yeah, just, do this thing that you found impossibly hard to do at the time. And, you had exactly the same advice about, or less articulated in detail than this typically, but you had exactly the same advice and you didn't follow it. So I guess maybe I should talk about how I actually did it. The first case with Aegis, not a great example because I just got so frustrated because I could just sense deeply, I am treading water here. There is, there's progress happening, but this is so slow. And it was almost like, saying, oh, I'm going to move across the country. I'm going to, move from the west side to the east side or whatever. And then I start walking and I'm like, I'm making progress. And then you're seeing people ride past on bikes and you're going, oh, they're a bit faster than me. And then you see people in cars going past and you're like, okay, a lot faster than me. And then you're seeing planes go overhead and you're seeing, I don't know, supersonic jets. And you're going, oh, actually, my progress is being hindered by something. And that something is me, not me genetically, me in terms of the processes that I'm choosing. That's not a great example of what to do because I just did a terrible method for so long that I got so frustrated that I just went ahead and started writing. And I wrote for like 7 months straight and I didn't look back. And it was a great experience because I just finally got to it all just kind of was so repressed in there and I was so frustrated that it just kind of, that kickstarted me. If you're in that position, maybe that's something you can try. I really hope you're not. It sucks and I sympathize with you, obviously. If you're in that position where you've, just done this research for ages and ages and ages, and you're probably delaying the writing until, the outline's perfect or whatever, in that case, maybe let your frustration control you to just completely go ballistic with writing. I don't know. That's what I did in that first attempt. But much more cogent advice is just to start as small as possible. The phrase I've heard used is minimum viable goal. Basically, like, what is the smallest possible thing that you can do in order to get you to do this thing? And oftentimes, people will say like, okay, all I have to do is write my first scene. Admirable, not a bad goal. But then they don't do it. And the typical problem I've found, and this is something I still have to like, I'm not like, the Ubermensch. I haven't completely conquered this or anything. It's something I still have to mentally really, actually actively target, is people do not think small enough, which is a funny idea, right? But they don't think atomic enough. They don't think in terms of atom-sized movements. And you can really just measure this by if you're doing it or not. And you just got to crank up the absurdity per se. So if you say to yourself, right, level 1, all I need to do is just write my first act of this script. That's easy. It's 1/3. Maybe you don't do it. Okay. All I have to do is write the first scene. After a week, maybe a couple of days, you don't do it. Okay. All I have to do is write the first page. Then you don't do it. Okay. All I have to do is write the first line. Let's say you don't do that. Then it becomes, okay, all I have to do is open up the program I'm going to use. Some people will fail that, and I have been in that position. Believe me, it gets that ridiculous. I say ridiculous, but it's real. It's a real problem. It can really get down to literally the minimum viable goal can be, I will use this sometimes for procrastination stuff, right? If I'm like, let's say watching a video on YouTube, I'll literally just say, okay, the minimum viable goal is I just close my eyes and I just stop visually watching it. The video continues, let's say, but I'm just going to close my eyes. That's the minimum goal. Now, it can go beyond that, but for me, that's like, come on. How do you fucking fail that? And then you don't. And then you train yourself to be able to do that. Then you train yourself to be able to do the next step. So sometimes you can just have these really stupid things blocking you from doing what you should be doing. Let's say in this case, writing when you haven't started writing yet. Or if you're avoiding writing, then I don't know, make it atomic. I'm getting a lot of that information from a book called Atomic Habits. Again, wow, shock horror. No one's ever heard of this book that's extremely popular currently. So the book really needs my endorsement. I'm shouting out a small little, indie publisher. I think all of that came out a lot more like schizophrenic than I anticipated it to. So hopefully there's something that could be gleaned from that kind of mess of random information. I feel like this podcast might be an example of like over time themes are clarified more and more. To be fair, in my defense, it is a really complicated process. But, to go back to this previous idea of interleaving, this is a kind of interleaving, right? I have writing knowledge experience from doing the writing in the various forms that I do it. Then, I might talk to other writing friends about it. And then I might talk in this format, which is slightly different, and it forces you to engage with your knowledge in a different way that will get more and more and more clear. And so again, just to make that really clear, that is what happens with research when you write. Your research has to be processed in your brain in a different way when you're writing. And that's like the special sauce, because you actually have to use the research and you have to use this knowledge that you have. For instance, like I studied a large breadth of things for Aegis, but it's totally different having that knowledge academically, having that knowledge in notes versus having that knowledge as you're actually writing it. And that engagement forcing you to deal with that knowledge and forcing you to use that knowledge in a real way. Like, okay, I have these themes from these philosophers, right? Or I have these, motifs from history, or I have, these certain cultural expressions that I want to convey. Actually being forced to use that in the writing really, A, cements your knowledge of it, and B, it really forces you to be very clear about what it is that you've actually researched, right? You actually have to really know what you're talking about in order to write that stuff. I mean, there are so many good things that come from that process of writing that it's going to take me probably many podcasts to actually kind of convey them all. It's where a lot of the discovery happens as well. Again, because if you're writing a script, that is, the next biggest step towards, let's say, if you're doing a film, it's the next biggest step towards the film itself. For a comic, it's the next biggest step towards the comic itself, right? an outline, random concepts on a page, that's going, these are ideas, right? They're not concrete. What you're doing effectively, again, I should have made this clearer in the beginning, but this is, again, a form of interleaving where my knowledge is becoming more and more refined as I talk about it, is you're going from the abstract to the concrete. You're reifying it, per se. Okay, now I actually have to write it. Oh God, that's totally different. That process is difficult, right? There's a lot of cognitive difficulty involved with simplifying concepts in terms of making them more and more real. It's like trying to explain like a complex concept to like a 5-year-old. It's actually quite difficult, right? Because you have to figure out a way to condense that information down to make it more legible. But that mental movement, that mental difficulty, again, is the special sauce. That's the real, I think, key to the writing, is that ability to actually take what is this, vast, nebulous thing, all of this research, all of these different strands, these things that are important, aren't important. You're having to make those value judgments as well, obviously. And managing to make them more concrete, just to squeeze them into a script. And then you've got to squeeze that down again into the actual production process, and then you've got to da-da-da-da. Obviously, I'm just talking about this first step. That whole second step is a whole other thing that is also complicated and is also, whatever, multifaceted. But just for now, that's the idea, right? You're having to go from this abstraction to this concrete step. That itself is a form of interleaving. It's a form of having to use knowledge in two different manners to convey it in two very different ways. And especially with story writing, it's a highly, highly complicated form of interleaving because it involves you weaving together various different kinds of research. And then you're having to do it not only explaining something to a 5-year-old, that's one thing, but you're having to tell a story that's interesting and has characters and makes people cry and, is on budget and, the technical limitations of a script. It's really hard. It's really hard. Sorry. Yeah, it's complicated, and I'll continue to talk about how complicated that is in the future. Hopefully that made some modicum of sense. I'm just going to talk really, really briefly about the current stuff I'm doing. Again, I really don't want to shill my stuff too much. I'm just really wanting to talk about my own experiences here, obviously. But if you are interested in my stuff, then I have links in the description to my mailing list, other socials. You can check that out if you want. This is kind of a case where I think it would obviously be a good idea. If you check out my stuff and you think it's shit, then don't take my advice. If it's not your cup of tea, that's totally fine. Obviously stories, one of the most, individually subjective things ever. So, totally fair enough. But obviously, if you think my stuff is incredible or something, then that would obviously make my advice more pertinent to you or whatever. Anyway, I'm having this weird experience, I guess, to summarize it. I'm basically doing the dream thing. I've got, 10 rough pages back on this series that I've been writing obviously for multiple years. I put a very large amount of effort into, an extremely high amount of thought and, blood, sweat, tears, that kind of thing. And yet I find myself procrastinating it. I find myself, not really actually doing it very much. I find myself, for instance, starting a podcast and learning how to post things on TikTok automatically. So I'm in this weird state, I guess, and I think that the underlying causes are very clear, but I guess what a lot of this present kind of literally stuff I'm dealing with right now, a lot of this is just going to be me being okay, well, I think I get what the problem is, and I have strategies that I'm cooking up to deal with it, but I don't know what the solution is. I mean, I haven't done it yet. It's actually really weird. I almost have this inverse problem to what a lot of people seem to have with writing. I never really had, this isn't bragging or anything, but I never really had a problem with motivation for writing. I would do it every single day effectively. At least with Aegis, I think I literally took maybe 4 days off where I didn't write anything over like 2 years. And those were days where I was like sick, like too sick to work on it. And, I'm not pretending that I was working, 10-hour days and slaving away. I'm talking about even if I did, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever, even a very small amount, I worked on it every day. But now I've had this odd case where now that I'm further along in production, that's like pulled back a bit. I mean, I'm pretty sure the reason is pretty obvious. It's because it's really daunting, because it's becoming more and more real, and because the decisions I'm making are more and more final, right? For instance, I got to give feedback on these pages to my artist, right? And if I, this is the fear, right? If I fuck it up, oh wow, my first 10 pages are now fucked up. So, hence the avoidance, I suppose. Now, of course, procrastination in that sense is not actually, that doesn't make any sense, because obviously if you avoid it, then it's of course going to be shit. And then, This is almost what I'd describe as like it's kind of a blip. I don't really feel like this is going to become, I don't want to jinx myself. I don't feel as if it's going to become, some kind of seminal issue per se. I feel like it's, a little just natural kind of road bump I have to overcome. But just to kind of talk about strategy, I guess, what I was doing right is I had to continue drawing, pages of, in Japanese, they call it like a name, basically storyboards for a manga. It's something that I feel very strongly about at this point, is about the writer engaging in the storyboarding process quite deeply and having a real strong back and forth with the artist. I really don't like the American, I guess mostly American method, where you just write like a script. You write like frame 1, frame 2, frame 3, and then you just kind of give it to an artist. Whatever, to each their own. I've just personally, anyway, I'll talk about that at length at a later date, as I feel like there are fairly strong arguments for what I'm talking about. Again, I'm not here to tell anyone what to do, but I feel like I want to like give people at least like an informed perspective, I suppose, especially since that seems to be fairly stratified between like the West and Japan. Anyway, long story short is that I had to basically do these pages, and I kind of wasn't doing them. So I basically did that minimum viable goal thing. I said, okay, all I have to do is just draw 1 panel a day. Now for me, that was enough to actually get me to draw 1 to 2 pages a day. Again, I'm talking like extremely rough, just to make my point about storyboards clear. Stick figures, basically stick figures, right? And yeah, the minimum viable goal was draw 1 panel, and I typically ended up drawing a page. I've sustained that, and okay, I get, 7 pages in a week. Now to be fair, I wanted to do 20, but 7 is better than 0, so, not the worst thing ever. And it then also trains you just to work on it every single day, right? It's an interesting thing I didn't expect. And it's again where, collecting these real experiences, working on real projects and going through all of the stages and going to completion is so necessary, because I've completed a couple of projects before this point and I haven't had this feeling before. And it was relatively strong. It basically made me stop working on it for periods. And again, just to reiterate, this is a thing that I had literally taken, it literally might have been 3 days off in like 2 years. A lot of those days were totally wasted doing a really dumb method, so it's not even that impressive. But yeah, that starts to be like, wait a minute, whoa. I only took days off when I had, I was like throwing up or I had the flu or something, and now I just can't, I can't be bothered. Is that it? But I guess I just want to reiterate that for some people, and I don't really blame them, because the feeling is so strong. For some people, they would read this emotionally totally differently. They would almost like believe it. Oh, I guess since I'm feeling not motivated, that means something real. The motivation somehow has some real, it stems from the soul or something. That's the belief, I guess. And I guess maybe I should just quit, because I guess I'm not motivated. And just to reiterate, I don't think that's a good idea at all, because motivation is such a fickle thing. And, for me personally, I don't feel like I ever had motivation with this thing. It was only ever like a ritual. It's just like a thing I just did, like brushing your teeth or whatever other, not taking a shit. It's like you don't think about it. You don't think about wiping. It's like that kind of thing, right? You don't really have to, force yourself to get up and do it. But, this is just a case where, I don't know, there's some chink in the armor where the process wasn't as like in a groove, maybe, going in and out of writing, then marketing, then back to drawing. The drawing wasn't as, iterated as like a habit should be, so it wasn't as strong. So then it was easier to break. That's just a speculation I have. Anyway, not a huge big deal, but just something I found surprising. Like you can still be kind of almost like shocked by these like close encounters this far into the process. Like, oh wow, this is something that almost feels like if I didn't approach this correctly, it could make me stop. It could make me give up entirely. And that really, like, unfortunately, I'm almost certain that this sort of thing would make some people stop. I'm trying not to end on like a dour note, because really it's fine, right? It's just like I've just kind of been knocked down a bit and I just got to build back up to a normal rhythm slightly, even if that is like from a crawling pace. So anyway, luckily that seems to thematically have tied everything together reasonably well. As always, I'd love feedback, especially on these early episodes. Is this incomprehensible? What do you think of like this set? It's a work in progress. I'm not sure if it feels almost too much like a tech channel. Anyway, hopefully you found this valuable. As I said before, if you're interested in checking out my work, right now, this is recorded in mid-October, 15th of October. Unfortunately, the competition results for both of these things I have that are in suspended animation, I can't release them, but competition results have not been announced. They're meant to be announced in October for one of them, and it hasn't happened yet, but hopefully it will. So probably by the time that you're watching this, unless if you're watching this in the last 2 weeks of October, it will have come out. You can check my links down below. I have an Instagram and I have a Twitter where I update this kind of thing. I also have a film review channel that you can check out that goes into a lot more detail about specific film and TV things if you're interested in hearing my analysis of that. But yep. Goodbye.